Please welcome to the stage the Interim Executive Director of the Promise Institute for Human Rights at UCLA Law, Catherine Sweetser.
Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Catherine Sweetser. As they just announced, I'm the Interim Executive Director of the Promise Institute for Human Rights at UCLA School of Law. And on behalf of UCLA School of Law, I want to first acknowledge UCLA's presence on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded lands of the Gabrielino and Tongva people. Thank you to our co-sponsor, the Aurora Humanitarian Initiative, and to all of you for joining us here today on the UCLA campus for our 2025 Human Rights and Humanitarian Forum. We are so honored to have some of the most eminent thinkers and scholars in the human rights and humanitarian fields here today, as well as the many Aurora luminaries and laureates from around the globe. I'd like to thank some of our speakers and participants in particular. Thank you to Dr. Eric Esrailian, who made the remarkable possible through being the founding donor of the Promise Institute for Human Rights at UCLA Law, along with the Promise Institute Europe and the Promise Armenian Institute. The Promise Institute for Human Rights' mission is to empower the next generation of human rights lawyers and leaders to generate new thinking on human rights and to engage our students and our research to drive positive real-world impact. It has been a pleasure to see the staff at the Institute grow the initial vision over the last 7 years as we expanded our work here as the Center of Human Rights Research and Scholarship on campus. You'll also hear from Professor Anna Spain-Bradley, our faculty director at the Promise Institute at UCLA Law. She has had an incredible legal career and is the author of Human Choice in International Law. Although she has just this semester joined the Institute, she's already been a tremendous leader in helping to shape a new future for human rights at UCLA, and she will be speaking later on our panel on the future of human rights. Later in the day, we're also going to hear from UCLA leadership, including Dean Michael Waterstone, the Dean of UCLA Law, and Chancellor Julio Frank, Chancellor of UCLA. Finally, we are going to close today with a keynote conversation by global leaders Chelsea Clinton, Lema Gabawi, and Peter Lawharn. We invite you to please stay with us after the keynote for a closing reception with the many luminaries and dignitaries that are here as well. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce Armine Afeyan, the Executive Director of the Aurora Humanitarian Initiative, to open our proceedings. Armine Afeyan has a BA in Political Science from Yale University, where she studied international relations, focusing on Armenia. She also holds an MBA from INSEAD. Please join me in welcoming Armine Afeyan.
All right, hello. I'm going to do the customary adjustment. I'm a tall girl. Good morning, good morning. First, our deepest gratitude to our co-organizers, the Promise Institute for Human Rights at UCLA Law. Special thanks to Kathy and her whole team for making this possible. I'm going to pile on the thank you wagon for Eric Esrailian, whose foundational role in both the Promise and Aurora brings us together in Los Angeles for a second consecutive year. Looking out, I see a lot of new faces, so you might not have known we were here last year too. Stay tuned, we'll be back next year. To the Promise team, the law school, and the broader UCLA community, thank you for opening your academic home to the vibrant network of Aurora humanitarians and their supporters. Welcome to the forum. We're gathering in a moment of great need in the world. We need foresight, we need longer-term vision, we need stronger leadership across sectors and more cross-sector experience to help us get there. We need more partnerships to get the most out of constrained resources, attention, time, funding. Along with these pressing needs, I'll add more compassion, more empathy, more humanity. That can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people, so let me expand. In another room, it might even draw an eye roll. Looking around this room, I'm relieved to see that's not the case, because that bodes well for the rest of our conversation. For Aurora, what I mean by more humanity is amplifying the stories and impact of humanitarians, specifically the human in humanitarian. The remarkable individuals taking courageous action every day to make their corner of the world better for their families, their neighbors, their communities. Aurora humanitarians show up as educators, healers, activists, artists. They span 6 continents. Special thanks to our Australian friend for really juicing the stats on that one. Thank you. They have collectively impacted the lives of tens of millions of people. Their stories arrive from humanity's worst, but they highlight our absolute best. We do what we do because of our founding principle of gratitude in action, the impulse to help when you've been the beneficiary of the courage and kindness of others. For all the shortcomings, all the needs of the world today, we can all still think of someone to whom we're grateful for helping us in ways both big and small. For our co-founders, it was characteristically big ways. The late, great Vartan Gregorian, Ruben Vardanyan, and Noubar Afeyan came together at the centennial of the Armenian genocide. Rather than taking the traditional, very understandable approach of focusing on perpetrators and their victims, they decided to look at the survivors and those who enabled their survival, those who saved them. They founded Aurora on behalf of the descendants of the survivors of the Armenian genocide, in gratitude to those who saved them. I've said that a lot, it is a mouthful. Without whose kindness and courage 100 years ago, millions of people around the world today would not exist. Looking around, I see many in this room. I can tell you right now, you've got at least one on this stage. They expressed this gratitude, they put it into action by creating the $1 million Aurora Prize for Awakening Humanity, awarded to an individual who's risked their own life to save others. 10 years on, the prize remains our flagship initiative and has impacted the lives of over 3.5 million people in over 60 countries across 480 plus projects. The prize is given in the form of a participatory grant, that is to say, the laureate receives part of the prize as an award for a job incredibly well done, but they actually go on to reallocate most of that funding. In so doing, they continue the cycle of giving, they uplift humanitarians around them, and we do this, at the heart of this approach is really the firm belief that they are the best situated, the best positioned to decide how that funding gets allocated. We hope, humbly, that because of their work, because of that participatory grant, there will be another room, another stage, 100 years from now, 5 years from now, 50 years from now, you name it, that can express their gratitude, that are there because of their actions. So it took us around the world and through time for a little bit there. I'm going to bring us back into this room now, into this moment. We held the inaugural Aurora Humanitarian Summit in this very room yesterday. We have here with us 40 Aurora humanitarians from around the world. Those are individuals who have come through the prize process and have traveled here to be with us today. We also brought in their LA-based counterparts for working sessions on the toughest issues that they're facing collectively, wherever in the world they are. No surprise, those turned out to be visibility and funding. I told them in opening that session that this is the place to be. This is the room to be in. And I can see many of them are back today, so I don't think they disagreed, and we can trust them on that. I've talked about the local humanitarian leaders in this room, but we've got a strong contingent of locals of another type, Angelenos and UCLA community members. There are a lot of places we could all be this week, especially. Together, we've chosen to be here, to hear from our peers, our heroes, our friends, and our friends-to-be. Collectively, we're all striving to shape a world that is just a bit better out there, and that starts in here, in this room. We can create together here today, even just for a few hours, the world that we want to see outside, and so I say, let's try. That's what this forum's all about. It's about coming together across borders and perspectives to ask hard questions, seek bold answers, help the helpers, and spark hope in the process. You'll hear from grassroots humanitarians, activists, legal thinkers, researchers, emerging leaders, and so many more. These individuals are challenging the status quo. They're pushing for justice, dignity, and peace in ways that are deeply human and deeply urgent. Our conversations today will tackle real stories and real struggles that can no longer be ignored. I invite you to experience them with the wonder and curiosity they're due. What gives me the greatest hope is the combination of diversity and unity in this room. We come from different backgrounds, we're coming from different types of days, different mornings, but we all have a shared commitment to making a meaningful difference. We envision a future where humanitarian and human rights emphasize together what they have in common, which is, of course, human. Specifically, those who are in and of their communities, wherever they are around the world. Thank you once again for choosing to be here, part of today. Let's do this together in this room out. Now for the good stuff. Our first session of the day, the Global Pulse Check. It is a big topic, but our panel are more than up for it. We're going to turn to the state of the world navigating the complexities of 2025. I'm going to set the stage a little bit and then pass it over to the experts. Global aid fell in 2024. The recent elimination of U.S. federal funding has led to dramatic cuts from development and humanitarian assistance, as other important donors are making similar decisions to reduce funding for humanitarian assistance. New data from the UN indicates that local organizations, especially those led by women, by refugees, have been some of the hardest hit. The first panel I'm about to call up will explore how we got here and what we can do to anticipate and adapt to the world that it's become since all these developments. Guiding the conversation is Nickolas Kristof, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and opinion columnist at the New York Times, whose decades of reporting have spotlighted both the urgency and the hope at the heart of global crises. Please join me in warmly welcoming our distinguished panel.
Well, thank you all so much for coming. We were saying earlier that every year we say that Aurora has never been more necessary, but this year it is more true than it has ever been. And we hope that we won't be saying that next year, but that will in part depend on the response that we face. Just today, you may know that the U.S. may be sending to Libya some migrants. To Libya. I've reported there, and it's scary for a New York Times person who's got New York Times credit cards and security consultants and so on. And to be a migrant shipped there, I can't imagine. At one point, I reported on a 16-year-old refugee girl from Sudan who went through Libya to try to get to Europe, and she found herself put in a hole in the ground with a board on top and taken out every day to be raped. And I think this is the place we are sending migrants to. So we have fortunately a terrific panel to diagnose the challenges and also to look at how we can begin to chip away at some of these challenges that we face. And at the end, I'm going to ask everybody to offer us a little bit of hope and encourage us. I don't want to leave everybody perpetually gloomy. So let me start with, and you'll see the panel here. I'm going to avoid spare long introductions, but Noubar, you are the board chair. Now, Aurora is 10 years old. It was founded in part to awaken people to the need for humanitarianism and human rights. So, how's that awakening going?
Yeah. Well, thanks, Nick, and thanks everybody for joining us. When we started, as was described, we coined initially this terminology of awakening humanity. And we wanted to use examples of modern-day saviors and heroes who risked their lives to save others. This was back in 2015, seems like a century ago now. And this was even before the first major waves of refugees hitting European shores and everything else that's happened since the pandemic, which created massive crises, and since then wars, etc. And so I would say that we're safely done awakening humanity to the barrels, because that's not the issue at this point. The issue is, what do we do about it, and how can we act more urgently than just shine a light on potentially forgotten conflicts. The first few years, a lot of the nominees in our project were from conflicts that were a decade or two old, and they had done heroic things, and we wanted to showcase their contributions. Today, it feels like we're getting nominations for people that have done something yesterday. I mean, it just is the whole world is burning with this trauma. And I would say, as kind of thinking about it this morning, that if we are a humanitarian contingency here, today the inhumanitarians are winning. There is probably no such word in English, but if there was, I think this is the era of inhumanitarians. And I think that we're all going to be facing individually choices as to when we speak up, because it's happening on our watch. This project is meant to bring resources, the world's attention, but it's kind of overwhelming. And now with institutional support diminishing rapidly, for these conflicts, it puts even more pressure on the individuals to act, both on the philanthropy side, but also in the field, actually saving the lives of others. So, and unfortunately, when we started, we thought 8 years to mark the 8 years of the genocide being perpetrated a century ago would give us enough time to awaken this project. We have committed to keep this project ongoing in a perpetual way by creating an endowment, but the work is increased by an order of magnitude.
Noubar, you said that the inhumanitarians are winning, and I can't argue with that. But I must say that I've always argued in the past that there is some arc of moral progress over time. The first international effort, a humanitarian effort on behalf of other people, the first movement on behalf of people other than oneself was the British anti-slavery movement, only in the 1780s, first international relief effort after the Irish potato famine. And now, I'm sure every UCLA bulletin board has any number of campaigns on behalf of other people, relief efforts on behalf of others. And so given what has seemed in general to be that arc, why are the inhumanitarians winning?
I mean, I wish I had the right background to be able to project a perspective on this that's all-encompassing. But I would say from where I sit, we seem to be in an era in our lifetime, which people have called polycrises, which is one crisis leading to another crisis, leading to another crisis. Given my involvement during the pandemic, I at least see roots of this in the global dislocation that the pandemic provided that caused a lot of simmering conflicts to just erupt. And in every which way, how humans behave to each other, how supply chain works, how economies work, how politics has become fiercely divided, all of these things are adding to the chaos and to the conflict as opposed to actually counteracting it. So I think to me, the scary part is the rapidity of this kind of almost autocatalytic, if you're a chemist, you'd know, a reaction that's going on, really has dislodged our society from a path we were on, including towards more moral behavior, more communal behavior, more understanding, more support, to kind of everybody on their own, kind of much more inward focused, people call it the G0 kind of era as opposed to the G8 or the G20. And the question will be, are we prepared to think differently about the era we're in? So while I think we have fond memories of when things were getting better and better along these dimensions, and we have lots of things to point to, individual pieces of hope coming out from stories, and many of these stories we can bring to the world. I do worry that we've been knocked off of the equilibrium that has defined our societies for 80 years, since the last major wars. And so I think rather than projecting doom and gloom, I just think that we should think about this not as something that's going to go back to normal, but to work towards a normal that might result from this, in which individuals matter, inequality is still top of the agenda, and all the things that seem to have gotten momentum can survive what seems to be forces that want to obliterate them.
Eric, we're looking for a global pulse check, and so what are the vital signs for human rights around the world? Give us a bit of an overview about how you see the human rights contours around the world right now.
So are you asking about the pulse because I'm a doctor?
Yeah.
I still know how to take a pulse. I can't really do much else. But first of all, I wanted to thank you, Nick, for moderating, and thank you all for attending, and for all the humanitarians who are here. I'm so inspired by the work you're doing, and for all of you who are here to learn from them, thank you for participating. I think it's a good question. I don't think there's one metric or one vital sign to focus on human rights, because I think while in some kind of corners of the world we see progress, in other corners of the world, as you just described in Libya, The stories are so horrific that, it's easy to just not want to learn about them, and I think we tune things out because it makes us feel guilty sometimes when you're sitting in the United States or in Los Angeles when you're hearing these stories. So we know that there's massive oppression in so many different corners of the world. And for me, I actually think about gatherings like this, and I meet such remarkable individuals and kind of have a gestalt of, do I feel optimistic still? And I do. I know it's maybe naive in some instances, but the fact that we're even here talking, we have an opportunity to gather. We're sharing stories from some of these great humanitarians who are here and the people who could potentially support them. Institutions such as this university that allow us to convene and create an environment where we can have an exchange of ideas and sometimes disagree, but yet, at least hear one another out. We have that here in the United States, and obviously there's always instances where we get discouraged, but I think about the history of the world and where we've been. I mean, you mentioned, the Irish potato famine and all these different things. I mean, if you go back in history, think about where the world was. There's actually nothing good about those, hundreds of years ago, the situations that people had hundreds of years ago. So some of the behavior that's demonstrated by autocratic regimes or oppressors, I feel like it's just it's kind of a replication of human behavior over centuries. But I don't think we had environments like this 100 years ago, and the ability to quickly support each other's causes and to provide aid for people in an instant across a financial system that's global, and share stories. I think it's much harder for people who are treating others with barbaric approaches to hide those actions from the world. Now, we deal with this. Noubar obviously has dealt with this for a long time. When we think about the situation in Armenia or the situation for Azerbaijan's behavior towards Armenians in Artsakh. But at the same time, we can share those stories, but then where does that get us? So we might think, it didn't do anything. We shared all these stories and it got us nowhere because people were able to act with impunity. But I actually think that empires rise and fall. Dictators can't live forever, even though I think people try to live forever. I got news for you. It's not possible. Okay, that's one thing I know about medicine. You can't live forever. I don't care what anyone says, what any futurist says, or whatever snake oil somebody's selling in Los Angeles. So at some point, there can be a change, and I think it's up to people like all of you who are here, who are kind of doing great work and are building networks that can support you to remember that it's always kind of darkest before the dawn.
Let me push back just a little bit on the optimism, and I do take your point, and that there are cycles, and I've covered dictators around the world. I have repeatedly been banned for life from various countries, and then it turns out not to be my life. It turns out to be the dictator's life, and then I write his obituary.
Very well said.
Which is very satisfying.
Exactly.
But that said, I think that in many ways the U.S., since the Jimmy Carter period, has been pivotal in putting human rights on the global agenda, albeit in ways that are often inconsistent, sometimes hypocritical, and yet we have helped put that on the agenda. And I look around, and it seems to me that in many ways the U.S. has switched sides on many of these global issues. One looks at Ukraine and Russia, for example, that we are now repeating Kremlin talking points, for example, in ways to justify aggression. So would you, I don't want to take away that optimism, which we desperately need in this room, but isn't there, in practical terms, fundamentally a profound setback in human rights that is underway?
Well, I think, I mean, that's obviously a good point, and I would say I don't allow my optimism to ever be taken away. You know, I'm the great-grandchild of Armenian genocide survivors. My great-grandparents wandered through the desert, literally eating dirt, you know, and here I am today. So I do hear you, but I think that for me, that's how maybe it's just to make myself feel better, but I think about that every day. I wake up, I thank God, I pray, and I try to do the best I can to kind of get everything out of my capabilities. Having said that, yes, of course. I mean, I think that there are circumstances where we get discouraged when we see, you know, kind of geopolitical, you know, warfare or the realpolitik of what's happening behind the scenes for financial reasons or for defense reasons, et cetera. But even then, I still feel like, you know, there's opportunities for people to kind of not just fight back, but to create alliances that can be sustainable for the long term. That's, I think, one thing we talk, there's a lot of things that you guys are all going to cover today, but when I think about governments, you know, governments are different than individuals. And you are all individuals who represent various causes and initiatives. And I would venture to say, many of you would say, oh, the politicians in my country are X or Y. But here you still are, you know, traveling across the world, doing all the remarkable things that you do, and without any real recognition other than us trying to show you some sliver of respect and applaud you for your efforts. But your countries, many of you, I've heard so many stories yesterday about how you operate in the darkness, yet you're still doing it. And you're risking your lives in many instances to do that. And people have done that over and over and over again. So yes, I think there's some kind of scorekeeping that's going on in terms of the governments and whose side are we on or whatnot. But I think, I mean, you're a much more established student of history than me. But even if we go back to kind of the halcyon years or, you know, glory years of any U.S. government, I think when we dig into it, we find a lot of darkness there too.
Comfort, your organization, the International Crisis Group, does spectacular work monitoring conflicts around the world. And so I've got to ask, are we about to have a nuclear war in India, Pakistan, or will the war instead be in East Asia? Or how do you see the situation in terms of global conflict risks through the prism of the ICG?
Yeah, no, thank you. You know, to wake up in the morning and to find the two nuclear powers potentially tearing themselves apart should give you a sense of what one's pulse rate should look like, Doctor, as well. Mine is pretty high at the moment.
And my pulse was high this morning.
Yeah, it's pretty high, and I don't see it getting any better. I mean, Noubar, you said this is the age of humanitarianism. This is also sort of the crisis of peacemaking that we're seeing. And I don't have good news, necessarily. In fact, I see it deteriorating further and further every day. Every single continent, every region now is touched by some kind of crisis. Internationalized civil wars, transnational crises, coupled with proxy wars, coupled with geopolitical tensions as well. So it looks pretty bleak right now, and it's very hard oftentimes to see a through line. You asked us to think about hope, but I also think there are pathways out to a crisis. The question is how we get there. We are seeing, you know, some kind of freelance negotiations taking place at one level, but we're also seeing the ugly face of peacekeeping and peacemaking as well. There was never, I mean, when I look back at the past, you know, we sometimes glorify the 1990s and the 2000s, and, you know, Gayle, I was watching you, you know, avidly trying to pursue various types of negotiations as well. But even in those periods, this was the era of the Rwanda genocide. Now, I was a student at the time of the Rwanda genocide, and every leader that I heard said never again to genocide. Darfur. And we said never again. No, Israel-Palestine. No, we said never again. So we keep repeating these words that will never repeat the past. And the past is with us every single day. So it's quite an indictment, both on leadership, but also on the architectures that are supposed to prevent, de-escalate, and find a through line to resolution as well. So it's very difficult to see through the storm and through the tsunami. And I wouldn't joke about the nuclearization point that you made, Nick, because one of the things that I think worries me and keeps me awake at night is that as people become distrustful of the architecture of multilateralism, as people begin to realize that transactionalism is the way to go forward, as people begin to realize that the old alliances are no longer trustworthy, and they begin to realize that might is right, then all those countries that always desisted or resisted from building up their own nuclear powers begin to think, actually, maybe the best way in which I survive the next era is to start building up my own nuclear infrastructure. So I'm worried about the potential for South Korea to start thinking that way. I'm worried about Japan starting to think about that way, because those alliances, those structures that often would ensure collective security systems are beginning to fray, and nobody no longer believes anymore in the idea of a multi-transnational approach or international cooperation in which to manage all the crises that we're seeing. So it doesn't look good as I speak to you today, when you wake up to a potential war between two giants of the Asia region as well.
For those of you who are students and had to wrestle with Thucydides, he might have seemed a little less relevant 5 years ago, but these days, rarely more relevant, that the strong do what they will, the weak do what they must, suffer what they must. In Gaza, then there's just very little bandwidth to pay attention to what right now may be the biggest international humanitarian crisis of all in Sudan, to Haiti, to Myanmar, to all these other crises. Is that part of the problem, that we collectively, not just governments, are just overwhelmed in ways that tend to self-replicate?
No, exactly. I mean, the headline, when you look at your newspapers, Ukraine is what comes up. It's Israel, Gaza. But under the surface, off the radar, those that are often not talked about are increasingly deprioritized. There was a period, and I mentioned Gayle because, I grew up watching Gayle a lot, but there was the whole Save Darfur campaign. Those who would be the pen holders of these crises are no longer playing a role in these crises. So in Sudan, we no longer look to the United States to be the ones who are doing shuttle diplomacy, for example. It is down to the region. But let me be very clear, it's the Gulf region that I'm referring to, not even the Horn of Africa countries as well. In the Sahel also, in fact, the international community was forced out because it failed to provide a security-first approach to the solution there. But it wasn't just the international community, it was the region. West Africa itself was asked to leave because it wasn't providing an answer. And then you're seeing gangsterism playing out in Haiti. Is the answer an international peace force? Is it a UN peace force? None of these are crucial answers to turning around the humanitarian crisis that we're seeing. The same whether you look in the Great Lakes region. In fact, as you talk about the age of inhumanitarianism, are we also seeing the age of mineral diplomacy? Is my get out of jail card going to be the fact that I have critical minerals? Can I buy peace? I have an answer for you. No, you can't buy peace. You cannot assume that negotiating your country's future through your mineral resources is going to get you out of a governance crisis, out of an insecurity crisis, out of territorial expansionism, and it's not going to address the corruption. It's going to solidify all the problems that you have in that country as well. So bad news for the Great Lakes. by signing a minerals deal to resolve your problems as well.
Gayle, you've worked in government and in the nonprofit sector in an area that was once pretty bipartisan, which was humanitarian aid. And you worked in Democratic administrations, but the Republicans in the President Bush era started PEPFAR, which was an extraordinary program, saved 26 million lives so far, President's Malaria Initiative and others. And now Elon Musk is boasting about feeding USAID into the wood chipper, as he puts it. So where do things stand for humanitarian aid as a way to actually save lives and improve well-being around the world?
Thanks, Nick. I was just contemplating whether I could go out and stand in front of a bus after listening to some of these comments. And just a couple things. First, thank you to Aurora for what you're doing, but I also want to give a shout out to all of you who are in the front lines doing the really important work. Nick's right. I've had the honor in my life of meeting a lot of big name, high-powered people, but I think we all know who the heroes are. So a vote of gratitude to all of you. And a vote of gratitude to the men and women of USAID, because the demise of that institution was not only done without any thought to the substance of programming or the impacts on foreign policy, but it was done with an exuberant cruelty. And as somebody who had the honor of leading that agency, I was proud to serve the most mission-driven people in the U.S. government. So a shout out to them. Okay, so what does this mean for humanitarianism, particularly in the States? The United States has been the world's largest donor to humanitarian efforts. And I think we saw recently, after the earthquake in Myanmar, where historically, 4 or 5 months ago, the United States would have deployed a disaster assistance response team, and these things are symphonic. They just get out there and they unfold and they react and they respond, and we would have been the lead donor. Millions of dollars, real relief would have been on the table. This time what happened, several days after the earthquake, 3 of the very few remaining USAID employees were sent from a regional mission to go take a look at what was happening, and they were fired while they were there. So that kind of sums it up. But I think while the actions of the Trump administration and Elon Musk are huge and grand and arguably cataclysmic, I think it's part of a larger trend in terms of where we are on humanitarianism. So where are we? Number one, we are facing, and have been over the last decade, more and more chronic humanitarian crises than ever before. I'm not old enough to say this, but 40 years ago, my friend John Prendergast and I started something called the Coalition for Peace in the Horn of Africa. It's worse now than it's ever been. Syria will be with us for years. There are parts of the world where we've got just chronic crises that are harder to solve. Second, I think we've seen some real failures of foreign policy. I've been feeling for a long time that the pressure has been put on the humanitarians to do all sorts of gymnastics to get food and assistance to people in incredibly dangerous and complex circumstances, while failing to invest the political and diplomatic capital needed to solve some of these crises. And I don't just mean the United States and Europe or the G8, regional governments as well. They are not investing what they can and should to bring some of these conflicts to an end. As a result, the pressure goes on the humanitarian side to pick up the pieces. Funding has just been dealt a real death blow for many people with a cutoff, major cutoff in U.S. assistance. But that trend line's been going down for years. At best, on foreign assistance from the world's leading donors, we've been flatlined. But we've seen in Europe, for example, over the years, that more and more of their foreign assistance is being spent domestically because of the huge intake of refugees. So the decline went like this, and now it's dropped off the cliff. The last thing, and the thing that troubles me the most, quite frankly, is that empathy used to be a thing, right? Like our common humanity used to be a thing. There are many of us who believe that whatever you want to say, and much of it is true, there's always been a foreign policy interest in the U.S. in providing assistance, but humanitarian assistance was always the projection of our common values. And that's like totally out. That's like a bad thing to do anymore. It's to focus on me, right? It's the problem we've had in the States for a long time. If I have health insurance and you don't, sorry, I'm okay. And we've kind of taken that internationally. And so I think on the one hand, we've got to be really frank with ourselves. This is a dark, dangerous, and devastating moment. I'd like to say we've hit rock bottom. I'm not sure we've gotten there yet. But I think we've got to be mindful, Nick, you may want to get into these questions in the next round, of two vulnerabilities that we face. And one is, it's very tempting to spend the bulk of our time admiring the problem. And it's a big problem. And I could sit here with you till 8 o'clock tonight talking about all of the horrible dimensions of the crises we're facing. We've got to be accurate in our assessment, but I think the second vulnerability is thinking there are shortcuts to solutions. These are big problems to solve. I wish it were true. I don't think on humanitarian assistance, for example, as I've heard from many people, well, we'll just have to get the private sector to fill the gap. Respectfully, if that was possible, the private sector would have been doing much more up to now. And I've tried in successive administrations. So we don't have quick fix solutions. I think there are many things we can do, and I'll wait to get into those, but I think if we're doing a global pulse check, where I come out is that we are at a period of danger and devastation, but we are also at a moment, and I want to go back to what you said at the opening, that demands our courage. Because this is a time where we've got to speak up, we've got to act, and we've got to fight for what we believe in. So that's where I try to put my, all right, this is bad, but bring it on.
I was in South Sudan recently trying to look at the impact of USAID cuts, and the thing that maybe the scene that particularly broke my heart was I was in a remote area in the northwest of the country, and I visited a maternity clinic that USAID had funded, and it had just opened last November. And for the first time, women there had access to prenatal care, to trained midwives actually delivering babies. And when I showed up and was asking questions about this clinic, the villagers were excited, and they came out and they were somehow under the misimpression that I was responsible for bringing this clinic there. And they were thanking me and thanking America, and they said no woman had died in childbirth since that clinic, American-funded clinic, opened in November. And there had been not one neonatal death since that opened. And there was a woman who was then delivering, and she wanted to name her baby after me in this misjudgment that somehow I was responsible. And then I had to tell them that the U.S. had just cut the funding for that program and that clinic, and it was about to close. And it just felt, multiply that by millions around the globe, and you see the impact. Women dying unnecessarily in the dust. Mm-hmm. And Gayle, you and I are of a somewhat similar vintage. We're both 29 years old. And, and the kind of remarkable thing about our lifespan is how much the world has actually improved by so many metrics in that period. When I was born, if you think that maybe the worst thing that could happen to anybody is to lose a child, when I was born, roughly 1/5 of all kids worldwide died before the age of 5. Now we're down to 3.7%. Incredible. When I graduated from college, 41% of humanity lived in extreme poverty. Now we're down well below 10%. Is that extraordinary, historic, rise in human well-being, how do we think of this moment when USAID is cutting, when Britain is cutting aid, France, Japan? Is this long, extraordinary period of improving human well-being, is that over? Is it paused? How do we think about it?
Depressingly, I think we're going to look at some setbacks. I mean, it's the numbers, there's no way we can get around that. And when you think, for example, the one I think about is the drug that was developed that prevents the transmission of the HIV virus from a pregnant woman to her child. And millions of women around the world have been put on that drug, many by the Global Fund and others, but PEPFAR has been probably the biggest player in that. So that means that there are all these babies that were born HIV-free. And now we're going to see that reversed, and we're going to see more babies born that are HIV positive. We're going to see a lot more young women dying of AIDS because that cohort is so big because of their vulnerability to transmission of the virus. We're already seeing people die in Sudan, as you know. So I think we're going to lose some steam on that. But I think there are a couple things that come out of that from me. You said you've got to be optimistic. I don't know if I'm optimistic, but I refuse to be a cynic, because then it's like, what's the point, right?
Yeah, what's the alternative?
you gotta believe in something. I think there are a couple things. I think that, in national security foreign policy, people talk about hard power and soft power. And the soft power people, that's like us. It's always kind of pat on the head. Oh, you're so sweet. You're the do-gooders. You're the nice people. And I think there's a failure to understand the massive power of soft power. So all that progress you discuss, your experience as an American being somewhere where people know that America funded their clinic. I was talking to a couple of women from Malawi and a gentleman from Bangladesh yesterday who you have these stories as well. I don't think we fully understand how that redounds to our benefit, to the fact that people that see, in this case, the United States as being the country that stepped up, led by George Bush, followed and expanded by Barack Obama, followed by Joe Biden, tried to stop it by Donald Trump the first, but blocked by Democrats and Republicans in Congress. It matters that people know that the United States was the country that stepped up to fight that epidemic, and it's also in our interest. So I think one of the things we've got to figure out how to do is push back on the argument that, oh, this is just wasteful charity, and if people would just take care of themselves, everything would be fine. It's in our interests to do it for multiple reasons. All of that said, and to your first question, there is no doubt but that over the next several years, and after that's going to take us time to rebuild, we're going to see numbers that have been going in the right direction move in the wrong direction. There's no question. I don't see any way around it. I think we've got to document that. I think we've got to publicize that. And lastly, although you're the moderator, I will say to you, because you could be a panelist also, Nick, we've got to humanize it, which is something that you do very well and have done to great effect.
Let me ask a awkward and maybe uncomfortable question that may piss off some people in the room, so brace yourself. I wonder to what extent we, the humanitarian and human rights community, needs to look back at whether we screwed up, whether we lost our constituency. I made the point that this used to be a bipartisan issue, and we lost a lot of America. We lost a lot of Britain. We lost a lot of folks around the world who today are probably applauding that people are being sent off to Libya. We didn't listen to a lot of people on questions like migration. Today we've been saying really nice things about PEPFAR, but when President Bush was actually rolling out PEPFAR, the liberal world basically complained about too much money being spent on abstinence only, rather than celebrating the fact that it was saving vast numbers of lives. We send signals out, without always meaning to, that we are liberals. We began today with a land acknowledgement. That it sends a signal, again, it is meant to be inclusive. I think a lot of conservatives hear things like that, and they do not perceive it as inclusionary. And so I wonder to what extent we need to think about our culture, about our outreach. You know, evangelical Christians have been, in some ways, an extraordinary community for humanitarianism, and I don't know that we have done nearly enough to build bridges between secular bleeding hearts and evangelical bleeding hearts. So just to all of you, to what extent do we need to look in the mirror and try to figure out how we can do a better job, not just preaching to the choir, but trying to expand that choir with people who disagree with us on many other issues?
Well, I'm the least qualified to answer this because I'm at best an interloper in this humanitarian world by virtue of having co-founded the Aurora Initiative. But I'll make a couple of observations. I think that this expression "politically correct" has been in our parlance for the last few decades, and I think what you're saying, Nick, is that maybe the politically correct thing to do would have been to ensure that there's political support for what it is that we do. And in fact, when the political support dissipated because we couldn't connect it to what a broader community of people thought was the right thing to be doing, that while preaching political correctness and kind of getting the ideology out, maybe some of the license to operate, unfortunately, has been weakened. And in some way, that's the way I take what you're asking. And I think there's a validity to that. Of course, the question becomes, is the opposite true, which is that do we have to adopt this ideology, and is there room for empathy and helping others in an ideology that says, yes, but as long as it's in this country, and yes, as long as it's under my terms, and et cetera. So I'm living it a little bit in the academic community, which is under higher ed, certain universities under massive attack, and there's a similarity to it, which is to what extent can you maintain some semblance of what you're trying to do by appeasing what would get you a license to operate back? Because I do think there's a calculus behind all of this, and one has to decide how much are you willing to pay from your belief system to reestablish your license to operate. And given that a lot of what we do out of principle, not because it's a transaction, this becomes a tricky issue. I want to say one other thing because in this previous section there was a lot of discussion about optimism and how to maintain it. And the world I come from, which is creating new companies and new technologies, we're often dealing with, like doctors, death. Basically, the ones that don't die might survive, might succeed, but we often see this constant struggle with why should anybody believe anything. And I just wanted to share, for all it's worth, my way of thinking about this, which does apply to the moment we're in. In that world, we talk a lot about paranoid optimism. Paranoid optimism, if you can keep those two mindsets alive in your brain, actually makes you poised to fight the dangers of the moment and yet be able to do the things it takes to thrive. And it may seem awkward because paranoia usually leads to pessimism and depression, but the reality is that you need to be optimistic to be able to see that things that other people don't believe can happen, and paranoid so you don't actually believe yourself and constantly iterate and iterate. So if you just think about that, and I can assure you from that battlefield that's the most kind of best way to stay alert and adaptive. The reason I say that, though, is because of what Eric said, which was, hey, I refuse to lose my optimism, etc., and I completely agree. I think in moments like this, rather than being less optimistic, we need to be more optimistic, but only provided we're also more paranoid. And I think the first set of discussions were our attempt at being extremely paranoid of what we're facing, so that we may be extremely optimistic as a path to getting out of it. So a lot of times people think that it's not kind of popular in bad times and you seem unrealistic if you're being optimistic. Quite the opposite. I think you need to double down on optimism, double down on paranoia. The two keep each other in check. In normal times, you can tap down both of them and you'll be okay. That's the way I reconcile. But to your other issue, I think that's a serious challenge. And I do worry that just like in the academic world, legal world, other worlds, a few companies, a few institutions are essentially accepting the conditions imposed on them. And the question will be, what are the conditions imposed on humanitarianism? I heard from some discussions recently that there's serious consideration being done to restricting the ability of US foundations to donate money externally. And essentially to do that by taking away the tax-free nature of such donations. Well, if that happens, obviously people will have to think about what they're giving money to if they want to enjoy the nonprofit status. And if that then means that a lot of foundations stop doing work externally, then how is this all going to come together? So these are real trade-offs. The question is, what do you do? Do you accept that? Do you fight it legally? Or do you move money out before all this happens, the way lots of companies are doing, shipping cars and medicines into the country quickly? It's just a crazy, crazy universe.
Nick, you invoked a country where I live in several times in your comments, the UK. And when Prime Minister Keir Starmer took the decision to further reduce the ODA, within a few days, there was an opinion poll, and the opinion poll was in his favor. There was no public reaction. There was no public condemnation. There was a political understanding of why he did it. Now the result of that political reaction, didn't sort of come out in the way he wanted, because last week, the elections from the local elections showed that Labour was losing ground to one of the most populist movements in the UK, Reform, as well. The challenge, and I'll never forget it, another former Prime Minister said it, and it was personal to me because of what she said, Theresa May. She says we have these stateless individuals who work overseas and they have no connection to their home. And that was me. She was condemning somebody like me who somehow was working in a different stratosphere and had no bearing on the community that I came from. Well, the reason I do what I do is because my parents were migrants, because my parents fled a country at war, because my parents were told not to go home. So this is what keeps me going every day, because I don't want to be told that I can't go home. And I don't think society wants to be also told that they can't go home or that they can't live side by side. So I think we've got to separate what our leaders say from what people believe as well. And if we conflate the two, I think we miss what humanity strives for versus what leaders think humanity strives for. Some of the things that they articulate on our behalves are not always accurate as well. Another perfect example, because she invoked the UK, was Brexit. It hasn't delivered what people are asking for. Otherwise, you wouldn't have a situation where the Prime Minister is trying to reset the relationship as well. There is a populist fervor right now in the European sort of space. But when you look and when you cut through that populist rhetoric as well, the views of those who feel left behind in Germany, in Sweden, in Denmark, in France, in the UK, is no different from the view of the person who feels left behind in India, in the Philippines, in Colombia. And that is what also gives me a certain degree of hope that we can, as a societal level, talk to one another. The question is to make the case, the business case, unfortunately, as to why a particular country should provide assistance to another country as well. The idea that you can live in isolationism, I think there's enough example in history where it does come to bite you in the end, where you decide to ignore another country's plight and think that it doesn't harm you. I think there are enough examples, for example, in the European sphere, to explain the ramifications of fallout when you ignore the plight of other communities that you think live far enough from you, and you think that that won't have a blowback effect. Guess what? You have diaspora in your countries, and they have an opinion as to how you treat peoples, whether it's in their communities or overseas. So I believe in society, and I think society will, in the end, also provide an answer that suggests that we don't think this age of humanitarianism or the age of impunity can continue without us having a view on it. And I think we have to cling on to that hope. Otherwise, Aurora wouldn't be doing the work it's doing, and you wouldn't have these humanitarian workers in this room today having this conversation as well. So the system is not completely broken, but we have to rethink how the system works efficiently as well.
Look, I think it's always good to ask, what have we done wrong and what can we do better? I think I'd come at it a little bit differently. I'll share with you one thing someone once told me that I have found to be extremely valuable, which is talk to people where they are, not where you think they should be, which is really hard because we all know where people should be. But so, think about who you're talking to. When you talk about the bipartisan consensus that we enjoyed for over 2 decades, the thing that's interesting there is that what brought that community together was focusing on the outcomes. It wasn't on the ideology of whether we should support women so that they didn't transmit HIV to their babies. It was, wow, we could make it possible for women with HIV to avoid transmitting the virus to their babies. Wouldn't that be great? So it was outcomes-based. It's become very ideological, and it's become a caricature. And I think some other things that have, when I look back, I don't know whether they're mistakes or I think it's failure to recognize the potency of things like the fact that all of these issues now are framed on the internet. So any debate, any issue is shaped and framed on the internet within literally minutes. If you look at what's out there on India and Pakistan right now, you don't have 2 days or 2 weeks, or you and I at 29 are old enough to remember when it would take a long time to even define and frame something. So that's number one. I think number two is that the way people talk and debate politics in Washington, or I would argue this is true in Kenya or South Africa or Colombia, is very different than the way people discuss politics outside of a capital city, right? The point of entry outside of a capital city is, how's my life? How are our schools? How are our kids? Do we have safety, right? Can I afford to survive? We get all policy, jargony, whatever, and I think we assume that those two discussions are equal. So I think one of the things we all need to be much better at is situating some of these conversations. The good thing is, in terms of a lot of things we're seeing in the States now, these town halls and demonstrations, they're very odd assortments of people coming together to talk about common problems in their communities that allow for multiple viewpoints. So I think that's another thing that we need to focus in on. The last, and I think the challenge for all of us, is I don't think compromise is a weakness. I don't have a problem if you and I can agree on an outcome, that if we disagree on other things, that's fine. As you pointed out, on PEPFAR, there was huge disagreement between Republicans and Democrats on abstinence. I inherited PEPFAR given my responsibility in Obama's first term, and I worked very closely with the Bush team, and we just agreed to disagree on that and focused again on the outcome. So we can compromise. I think the one thing we've got to be careful of, though, is not to abandon our fundamental convictions. Is that I think that what we are all fighting for in humanitarianism, if it's putting the human back into humanitarianism, if it is the belief that it is our obligation, our responsibility, and also our opportunity to stand with members of our community when it's needed, our belief that everyone should have the ability to go to school, to learn, to access opportunities, that's something we believe, and I think we've got to do a better job of selling that and be careful about reshaping that and say, well, I don't really believe everybody should have equal opportunities. I know that's not what you're saying. But I think, how do you balance between compromise as an art and a tool and talking to people where they are rather than where you think they should be, but also holding on to fundamental convictions? Because I absolutely believe at the end of the day that with the vast majority of the people in this world, including if you acknowledge the struggles and hardships they may face, but if you put the proposition to them that we should help somebody next door whose house just burned down, they would say, yes, we should.
I've got a moderator's dilemma in that I have 2 more hours of questions and 5 minutes and 38 seconds left in which for us to resolve these problems. And in particular, I did want to ask both Eric and Noubar about science and AI, because it may well be that historians will look back and think that the most important thing that was happening in this period is not Donald Trump, but his developments in AI and the impacts they have on the economy, on health, and so on. And I also want to get some sort of a sense of where we go from here, and I want to give people a little less gloomy sense of where we can go. I want to call on each of you to kind of help put a spring in people's step as they step away from this after our covering all these problems. And so I'd like to just call on you each to give a sense of kind of where we go from here and encouragement. And I will just lead in what gives me a sense of what reassures me, even at this incredibly difficult time, is seeing, look, I've had a career covering war and genocide and poverty and disease and human trafficking, all the terrible things. But one of the things I've learned is that side by side with the worst of humanity, you find the very best. Yep. And that when people are truly tested, they are capable of incredible things. And in rural Pakistan, I once met and wrote about this extraordinary woman called Mukhtar, who had been sentenced by a village council to be gang raped because of something that her brother did. And the village council then, they followed that through. They raped her. And their expectation was she was going to kill herself out of shame. And instead, Mukhtar found it within herself to prosecute her attackers, to send them to prison, to use compensation money for the rape to start the first school in her village, because she thought education was the best way to chip away at misogyny and cruelty of the kind that had victimized her. And then she enrolled the children of her attackers in her school. You just can't be in that village and see her attackers' children in their school uniform studying math and Urdu and just not feel that we are an amazing species. And so that is what gives me this sense of possibility, represented by this incredible talent in this room and determination to address these problems we've been talking about. And so now the floor is yours. Why don't we again start with Noubar and then work our way this way? Reassure everybody.
Well, look, I definitely do think that the miracle that could counteract a lot of this, and I say miracle only because that's what this technology could in fact bring, an unexpected, unexplainable, outsized impact on something our brains don't quite understand in every which way. It'll look like a miracle, is what the more recent versions of generative AI can offer. I would say, having spent the last 38 years in science and technology and innovation, there's absolutely nothing that remotely compares to what this will be able to do to what humans can do in response to the challenges that they have. If we were walking and using horses to get around, and computing and ultimately the internet became cars and trains for longer distance travel, this is nothing short of flight. And the fact is that humans can't fly on their own, but boy, can they invent machines they can fly with, and we've shown that. And this will be the act of flight, in my view, for the human imagination, for the reasoning. We will be able to essentially access knowledge, apply knowledge, recombine knowledge, and extend it both in depth and in breadth in ways that no single human or no thousand of us have been able to do. And I'm not saying this to profess and to advertise anything. This is just what I'm experiencing every day. And the question will be, is that empowering to individuals, or is that a method to suppress individuals? And the answer to that is yes. It will be both. It will be both. But there is a moment in time that the access to it, which is not going to be the cost of an airline ticket, because I think access to it, given the connectivity in the world, will be more readily available in the hands of people who are just desperate enough to try, might create totally new opportunities. So I do feel that evolutionarily, the moment in time of dislocation and disruption couldn't be a better time for a new species, a new force to be born out of this. And I say new species not to replace humans, and there's a lot of discussion. That's not what I mean, but a new version of humans that are effectively augmented. I've long said that we should think about AI as augmented imagination, augmented intelligence. Last week I gave a long talk about how we could view it as alien intelligence, only because it feels alien to us right now. But guess what? Flying objects seemed aliens to people 100 years ago, and I took one to get here today. And that same alien nature, artificial sounds weird to me, alien nature, you should come to see as a pathway to potentially doing what humans can do with otherwise aspirational capabilities. And I'm not saying it to make anybody positive. I believe this is the reality we're living in, and it's one of the ways out.
Eric.
So I just, first of all, thank you all. I've been enjoying listening to you. I hear myself talk a lot, so I'm actually over it. But, I think you're an optimist after all, Nick, because of what you said. I mean, I truly believe, look, first of all, real quick on AI, I'm connected to a lot of entrepreneurs, and I think AI will be an incredible tool for human beings. But I want to talk about human beings for a second, because all the people here, again, are inspirational to me. One of the reasons why I've been honored to be a part of Aurora or to help start the Promise Institute for Human Rights is because I do believe that once you're sitting across from another person, talking to them, even if you disagree from them, it's a lot harder once you get to know them to wish them harm or to do something harmful to them. And I think that I'm still inspired by the potential that we have to okay, we'll use AI to learn a little bit maybe about somebody, but get in the room and talk to somebody. And Gayle mentioned the soft power. I think my goal is to connect people like all of you to the people who are in the rooms making decisions. I think when you're sitting there, maybe one of you will arrange for you to sit across from somebody who you might despise because you think that they're doing all these bad things in the world. But when they hear your story, they may make a decision that will transform the trajectory of what a country is going to take. So I really do believe that, and of course it's a bit naive and optimistic, but we just lost Pope Francis, and I think I'm not Catholic, but I had the honor of meeting him a few times and making a documentary about him, and I was inspired by a lot of decisions that he made, including taking the name Francis for St. Francis of Assisi. And if you look at his story, it's very different than many other kind of religious leaders that you might think about. And yes, was the Pope perfect? I don't think so, but I still respect and admire a lot of what he did and what he said publicly and privately, because I feel like he had a lot of faith in humanity, despite, he saw it all as well. But I feel like, we have to kind of think about people that we want to emulate and be like, and I'm honored to sit here in front of all of you because you all make me want to be a better person.
Comfort.
Thank you. As you were asking the question, one of the things that gives me hope is the imagination of humanity. And I'll give you a really good example. In Sudan, there was a resistance committee that was resisting al-Bashir and the army and the militias. And that group of resistance committee, in the plight of the cruelty, the humanitarian blockages, they converted themselves into an emergency room and started to be the frontline respondents. And that is really important, that in the midst of the onslaught, of the violence, of the horror and pain that is inflicted of you, that you would be able to transform yourself and start working across different sectors. So that gives me home, that the ability of humanity to be innovated at a moment of when they're up against the wall. I think the other thing that gives me hope is what you said, Gayle, about exuberant cruelty to define USAID. If what comes out of it is a new model that really understands what countries also need, and that it's really based on a partnership approach, not a basket sort of case approach, when it's not just about the humanitarian assistance, but really focused on a meaningful partnership. I wouldn't say that this is worth it, but if that was what comes out of it, then that would have been an important, efficient reform. It's a horrible way to have dismantled a system, not just USAID, but globally. It's a horrible way to have done it, but if what comes out of it is one that really addresses the needs of a country, then that's important as well. And because you mentioned Pope Francis, I am a Catholic. Nick, it was your newspaper that talked about the imperial papacy. Everybody needs a moral compass. And we're all waiting to see what comes out of the Sistine Chapel in terms of the white smoke. So let's see what happens as well today. Thank you.
Sure. And you're right, to your point about Sudan. I got my start as a journalist and then relief worker during the Ethiopian famine, and I saw the most horrific things I've ever seen, but I also saw things of such potency in terms of the good that human beings can do that I've always believed that anything's possible since then. 3 things I think we can focus on. One is, can we change the frame? Are we having a referendum at the global level right now? We're kind of having a referendum on the last 75 years, right? Does that whole system work? Flip that on its head. Let's have a referendum about the next 75 years. And that's the space that the world's political leaders are not really doing. They're kind of relegating the recent past. Let's talk about what we want the next 75 years to look like. Number 2, I know there are a lot of people here, and it's been very keen to Aurora, to figure out how do we empower local humanitarianism. Well, we do have a bit of a white sheet of paper now, to Comfort's point, given everything that's been destroyed, say, on the US side, but it's going to affect the entire global humanitarian structure. Let's not wait and say, how can we persuade them to start thinking about what it would look like. If you built this humanitarian architecture from the bottom up, what does it look like? And why not start having that conversation right now? The third thing, and it gets back to a point that you made, which is about telling your stories. I've worked with a lot of members of Congress, both Democrats and Republicans, some of them more cynical about the US doing anything on humanitarian aid or development than you can imagine. When they went on a trip and they met real people, it didn't matter what I said. When they met real people and saw real things, they flipped. They saw the humanity of it. So I think it's on all of us to figure out how, in building a new constituency, we tell more stories of people like all of you, because at the end of the day, that's the most persuasive thing.
Well, thank you for all that all of you do. You inspire us. You are helping us address this crossroads that we find ourselves at. And please join me in thanking our extraordinary panel here.